A very good afternoon. I request everyone to please take a seat. In the session this afternoon, we'll be discussing the Encyclopedia of the Sri Lankan Diaspora that was launched yesterday. I'd like to now invite our guest, Mr. J.Y. Pillai, Professor Tan Tai Yong, Dr. Vishwanathan Navaratnam, Dr. Razeen Sally, Dr. Patrick Mendes, Dr. Rajesh Rai. Just a brief introduction of our chairperson, Mr. J.Y. Pillai. He's the chairman of Tiger Airways Holdings Limited, rector of College of Alice and Peter Tan, National University of Singapore, and chairman of the Securities Industry Council. He has also been a member of the Presidential Council for Minority Rights since 2003. He served in the ministries of Finance, Defense, and National Development, and as Managing Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation. I now request Mr. Pillai to please introduce our guests and chair this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? No echo? Yeah. Well, welcome to this session on the, it's actually on the book, the Encyclopedia of the Diaspora. But of course, you know, you're all very alert and active, and you may want to actually talk about the diaspora, things that are not in the book. And by all means, the room is not that crowded, but I'm sure the quality is very high. There's been a little bit of competition from the other side, but they are the RT people.
Yeah, and media.
The RT and media people. So the serious people are here.
I think so.
Well, I don't have to introduce my colleagues here because their CVs are in the material, the brochure that I think you all have. If you haven't read it, please do so now. I myself had to brush up on it just before this meeting. I'll invite each member of the panel in turn to speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. I'll start with Professor Tan Tai Yong, who's the provost in the National University of Singapore and also the head of the, you call the CEO or the
CEO.
Director? CEO.
Chief servant.
Of the Institute of South Asian Studies. Actually, those lights bother me because, you know, I can see the lights and dazzles me. I can't see the people. Yeah. So I would rather, you know, we had more uniform lighting if somebody could help out, please. Otherwise, I won't even know who's put up his hand to say something.
No, after that, during Q&A, they'll turn on the light.
Oh, they will, eh? Yeah. So for the timing, the limelight is all on you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pillai. Well, as the first speaker, I thought it might be appropriate if I provided the background to this project to explain why we decided at the Institute of South Asian Studies to do this project on the Sri Lankan diaspora, and then to explain the processes which we took to get this off the ground, after which I think my colleagues who actually then did the editorial work, and then also our fellow panelists who were advisory would have more to add to how this volume eventually came about. So the genesis of this project actually could be traced back to an earlier volume on the Indian diaspora, which was published in 2006. This was the Encyclopedia of the Indian Diaspora, done by the South Asian Studies program at the National University of Singapore. Now the idea was planted, for that volume, was planted by then President Mr. S.R. Nathan, who have always held the belief that Singapore was an ideal location for us to develop understanding and studies of the South Asian diaspora. So he started he planted the thought in the head of the South Asian Studies program then, Professor Peter Reeves, an Australian academic who was then helming the program. And he asked me to serve on the the editorial committee of that volume. So the volume was produced. It was called the Encyclopedia of the Indian Diaspora. But I want to say that it was not focused on India as a country per se, but India used in its broadest term to refer to the Indian subcontinent. So the encyclopedia was broad and comprehensive in its coverage to include the entire subcontinent, although it was not called the Encyclopedia of South Asian Diaspora. So that was the volume that was published, and I must say that it was a fairly successful project. When it was published, soon after it was published, it sold, I'm told, 16,000 copies worldwide, translated into a number of languages. But I think the most important thing about that project was that not only did it sell well, but generally it was accepted as an authoritative and fair as well as objective account of a very complex subject matter. So that was the Encyclopedia of Indian Diaspora. Now, following on that success, Mr. Nathan then had another meeting with us and said, why don't you guys do a follow-up to this project? And because you've covered quite a big sort of a landscape in the first volume, but now is the time perhaps to go into more detail with the specific countries in the region. So he suggested a series of follow-ups to the first volume on a country basis. And for some reason, after a discussion, we felt that it might be best to start with the Sri Lankan diaspora, maybe because of its more distinctive nature. So that was how it started about 2 years ago. And then he put that responsibility on me and said, since you were involved in the first one, why don't you follow up? And I said, well, you can't say no to the president, right? So I said, yes, I'll do it. And we got the Institute of South Asian Studies, which I was then, which I'm still directing, to take on this as an institute's project. Now, the simplest thing to get something off the ground quickly is to base it on a model that has worked in the past. So since we have already done the Encyclopedia of Indian Diaspora, I decided to follow the same format and to also get the same team. I immediately approached Professor Peter Reeves, who has by then retired to Australia, but he was game enough to take this on, and he said he would travel back and forth. And then I got his very able deputy, Dr. Rajesh Rai, who worked with him on the Encyclopedia of Indian Diaspora, to come on board as well. And then we got a very young scholar, Hema Kirupalani, who had just finished her master's in the South Asian Studies program, has a deep interest in the studies of Sri Lanka, and she said she could afford to do 2 years in ISAS to work on this project. So we assembled the team, which was an experienced team and which had a lot of ideas and also the energy to take this forward. Now, I think Hema is in the audience, and I would like her to participate in the discussion afterwards, because she was the person in the institute who bore the daily grind of producing this very important piece of work. So Peter worked from Australia, Rajesh supported us and did a lot of work as well, and Hema was the third person of the team in ISAS. And of course, we decided to go back to the publisher who did such a good job with the first volume, EDM, Editions Didier Miller, and they worked very closely with us. So that was how the project team was formed and the idea was started. Now, we did 2 other things because we understood that this project could also be slightly controversial. So we decided that we should take some soundings from people who are interested in this project, to hear their views, to get some initial inputs first. So one of the first things we did before we launched the project was to organize a symposium at the Institute of South Asian Studies, where we invited scholars as well as interested parties from within Singapore to participate. It was a very useful session, and we had very good suggestions and recommendations from that meeting. The other thing we did was to form an international advisory panel, because we felt that it would be good to not just look at things from the sort of a local Singapore perspective, but to get a broad global view as well. And the members of the advisory panel are here. I think Patrick Menzies, Dr. Navaratnam, Mr. Pillai, and Dr. Razin Sali. The panel was chaired by Sir Arul Kumaran Sabaratnam, a very distinguished doctor from London. And also there was an Australian member who's not here with us this time, David Kretzer. So it was a distinguished panel, and they gave constant advice. We showed drafts to them, and I think under their guidance, the encyclopedia took shape. So perhaps I should stop here, because this is where I think then the idea was conceived, the structure was set, and I guess the work was then passed on to the editorial team, and perhaps Rajesh could take off from here to explain how the book was further conceived. I'll stop here, Chairman.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Tan. I'll now invite Dr. Rajesh, who is also a key participant in this exercise, to say a few words. 5 minutes, Dr. Rajesh.
Thank you, Prof. And I think I want to talk about 3 elements of this book. One is the structure itself. As Prof. Tan mentioned, we did draw from the model of the Encyclopedia of the Indian Diaspora because it turned out to be a very successful model. What about this model makes it a success? I think in any encyclopedia there's a problem that arises. How do you deal with a community-based study, and how do you bring together that with themes that you also want to pursue? Themes in terms of aspects of everyday life of the diaspora that may fall outside the community section and where there may be broad linkages. So the model that we followed in terms of the structure of the book was to divide it into 2 parts. One being the contextual section, and in this volume there are 3 sections to this contextual element. The first part deals with Sri Lanka, its people, its history, its politics. Now, one would question, why would a volume on the diaspora have a section like this that deals with Sri Lanka's history, in a sense? I think it's necessary. It's necessary because it contextualizes the artifacts that people bring with them when they move into the diaspora. So we have in the first section that part that deals with Sri Lanka. In the second part, in the second section of part 1, we look at life and people in the diaspora. And here are the very interesting, lively elements of the diaspora in terms of its food, culture, and cuisine, what people brought with them, and how these changed, and how they adapt to the new environment. Sports, which is another element of life and peoples in the diaspora, popular culture. We have a very interesting section done by my colleague at South Asian Studies, Siddharthan, on transnational marriages. And we also have one which may be of interest to many in this audience on entrepreneurship and remittances. So this is a largely thematic section. It's one of the thicker sections of this book. The third part, and we've separated this out from life and people in the diaspora, is a section on literature. And the literature section, as I believe Meerachan mentioned yesterday, I think is very important because of the great contribution of the South Asian diaspora to global literature. And I think as much as the Indian diaspora has achieved much in terms of the wonderful novels it has produced, I think members of the Sri Lankan diaspora have done no less. So that's another important element in the contextual section. Now, once we moved away from the contextual section, we moved on to the next part, which is really roughly 2/3 of the volume. And here we have country and region profiles, 21 countries and regions. We have coverage of 4 continents. And some of these have been dealt regionally rather than as individual countries. One case, for example, is the issue of the Gulf. And one of the reasons we do that is because of the similarity of the experience across that region. Another place that we have done it is in the case of Eastern Europe, where we brought in a few countries together because in some respects the diaspora is too small there to really warrant separate country-based studies. But the other cases have been dealt with individually. And through these community sections, then we bring together the myriad journeys of the diaspora. And I hope that you will enjoy the volume when you do manage to pick it up. So I think for now, that's what I have to say, and maybe we can move on to the advisory panel and their roles in it.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. I think I'll invite Professor Navaratnam. See if you will.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Pillai. To put matters into historical perspective, anthropological evidence shows that there have been movements into and out of the Sri Lankan area from the dawn of mankind, initially across land bridges, and subsequently, of course, by seafaring people who formed settlements both in Sri Lanka and in the coastal regions of countries bordering the Indian Ocean. Now, obviously, this does not constitute the diaspora as we know it, but it is interesting that both these forms of movement into and out of Sri Lanka figure in the historical mythological epics of both India and Sri Lanka, in the Ramayana and in the Mahavamsa, with the movement of Rama and his followers to Sri Lanka, and Prince Vijaya travels to Sri Lanka as well. Moving on to historic rather than prehistoric times, the encyclopedia, I think quite rightly, focuses in very many sections on the important role played by the Sangha of Sri Lanka in fostering and promulgating and propagating the tenets of Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia by forming groups of travelers who settled in various countries, establishing viharas and meditative groups in these countries. And these, I think, are genuine aspects of the diaspora which are not traditionally included in our discussions. But I think this is a long-lasting, noble legacy that Sri Lanka has left in the region. Coming to the sort of formally accepted notions of diaspora, these seem to center around movements from the British colonial period onwards. And this is the main focus of current discussions, and the encyclopedia goes on to discuss this in great length. There are some 3 million people who have moved out of Sri Lanka and have been settled abroad. These numbers will undoubtedly rise because of current problems will press other people into following them. But also there will undoubtedly be some return to Sri Lanka, especially from the Middle East, when the geopolitical conditions there change. Now, I would like to sort of just broadly divide the diaspora into 4 sections, which I shall come to in a moment. The point I would first like to make is that the scale and extent of the Sri Lankan diaspora is very limited. It's fractional compared to the Chinese and Indian diasporas. But these very limitations give us the opportunity to identify and analyze the factors underlying diasporic movements of various populations. Now, I would like to focus on 4 cohorts of the diaspora, and this might help us in our discussion. Initially, the spread was into the reaches of the Empire and Commonwealth and into the English-speaking world, which, of course, Sri Lankans were very well equipped to handle. And these, initially, they mainly comprised movements of middle-class professionals and white-collar personnel. And 2 cohorts that come into mind are, firstly, the movements of Jaffna Tamils to Malaya and Singapore. And this was mainly a pull factor attracted by employment in these regions. There was no push factor because there was no pressure in Sri Lanka to push people out at that time. And the movements were orderly, families moved out and settled into flourishing communities in Malaya and Singapore. And in fact, there were interactions with the native country, and communities here, members of these communities, felt comfortable enough to travel back and forth with Sri Lanka. And during the Second World War, during Japanese occupation, many Sri Lankan diasporic elements returned to Sri Lanka to spend some time there. As a student, when I entered the medical faculty in 1950, there were several colleagues of mine who were children of the diaspora in these countries. And they returned to study in the Colombo Medical Faculty, because at that time, medical teaching facilities had not been established either in Malaya or Singapore. Subsequently, in fact, many of these individuals formed part of a second phase of their own diaspora and returned again to Singapore and Malaya. And several eminent examples could be mentioned, but that had some very interesting components to it. The second cohort I would like to mention is migration of the Burgher community to Australia. Again, this was largely a middle-class professional and white-collar personnel migration. Largely started because of the attractions offered by the Australian immigration policy shortly after the war. But this became exacerbated in 1956 when policy in Sri Lanka was starting to make things uncomfortable for minority communities. But again, the migrations were planned. The communities flourished in Australia, and they form a very largely settled population in that country now. Migrations continued on an individual basis, largely following these patterns to parts of the British Commonwealth, to Britain itself. And the patterns changed, of course, in 1983, when the migration patterns were now largely caused by push factors, by increasing racial tensions and persecution in Sri Lanka. Now the pattern of migration changed dramatically because now the personnel who were moving were not only middle-class professionals and white-collar workers, but now it reached deeper into the fabric of society, and these will not be easily replaced in Sri Lanka. People who had worked the land for generations in Jaffna, northern province and eastern province, people who had harvested the seas, found it necessary now to move out, often in an unplanned, chaotic fashion, even in illegal, by illegal means.
Do it, wrap it up.
Yeah, okay. And so these, of course, create a different kind of problem, and they are more unstable element of the diaspora. The last group I would like to mention are those who have gone into employment in the Middle East. And these are, again, large numbers of skilled workers, largely from the south of the country, who include mechanics, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, housemaids, and domestic staff. But largely these people go as individual single wage earners, largely disrupting family life. And of course, they form a different component of the diaspora. I'd just like to leave these thoughts with you, and perhaps these things will be taken up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'll invite Professor Patrick Mendes now to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Pillai and my colleagues. My colleagues asked me to share with you how I get involved in this project and my contribution to it. And today I'm speaking to you in my personal capacity, not any other affiliation with other institution I'm involved. Here, Ambassador Pillai asked me to serve on the international panel at the recommendation of an American diplomat. Then I agreed to serve, and I got to have an extraordinary privilege to work with a talented group of colleagues who are, some of them are here, and especially Hema that Professor Tang mentioned about it. She's an extraordinarily talented young Singaporean, and I was able to work with this group. And throughout this process, we have some disagreement, some agreement how we wanted to proceed in this project, because this is very complicated. The only model we had was a previous project that Rajesh was talking about, Indian diaspora. But this one is more complicated, even though Sri Lanka is a small country. But the problem we had was in order to establish facts, the statistic, these are especially problematic for us, especially when I was beginning to write about the Sri Lankan diaspora in the United States. I have to trace back to the earliest time and how it's evolved over the years. But there was no direct statistical reporting or recording, largely because in the US Census, Sri Lankan diaspora is categorized as a South Indian or South Asian. It's a one big lump. There is no desegregation of that statistic. A big challenge on that one, but I went to the newspapers to do research in order to establish this chapter on the US. At the very beginning, what I noticed was Dr. Ananda Kumaraswamy, who came to America, and later he became the curator of the Boston Museum. Those who know about him is a distinguished Sri Lankan, and he made initial contact and contribution to the American society as one of the great Sri Lankan. And then most recently, and Dr. Cyril Ponnam Peruma, who also worked for NASA and my previous university, University of Maryland. And he was also the one who experimented on the sample. We got it from Moon. So he made a tremendous contribution to the science and technology in the US. And even most recently is Dr. Ananda Guruge, the Buddhist scholar, who was a Sri Lankan ambassador to the US and now became an American citizen. Is also part of it. And in addition to that, we have the circle of Buddhist temples in in the US. Like one of the earliest one is New York Viharia and Washington Temple and even Houston, and also the my home state of Minnesota, very near to the Canadian border, northwest of Chicago, has a very prominent Buddhist community. And Minnesota itself is an important part of this diaspora in early 1970s. Everybody who said you are going to Minnesota, they connect with you as Sri Lankan diaspora who are working in Montessori's. So there is a big Sri Lankan presence, and the first Sri Lankan restaurants was in Minneapolis and Twin Cities in Minnesota. I came to Minnesota as an exchange student in late 1970s. Then I returned home, and then the war started, and the little community that I grew up nearby Fargo, North Dakota, got together, raised money, and asked me to come back. Then I went to the Humphrey School of the University of Minnesota. Then I taught there before I went to the state level government, Minnesota legislature, to the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee, and the federal agencies in 5 different agencies under 2 American presidents. So that's the kind of one layer of Sri Lankan community. But on a common, in general way of speaking, Sri Lankan community in the US is largely a very skilled and highly engaged group of people. They are either doctors, professors, engineers, even scholarly Buddhist monks, in many sorts, widely spread, unlike to some diaspora in Canada, for example, that happened, increased after the beginning of 1980s, after 1983. So Sri Lankan diaspora in the US is also well engaged in a political process as well, and also the NGO community, they are very prominent. So in that sense, even though Sri Lankan community has a very elusive beginning, but we have around, according to the latest statistic, about 25,000 Sri Lankan in high profile positions, all the way from the Ivy League school to Montessori's in Minnesota. So there is one of the key issues that you may probably read in that chapter is the how Sri Lankan diaspora in the US engage in our political process to influence the Sri Lankan domestic political issues related to, especially related to the war issues and the separation issues. It was very prominent in 1980s when the group of Tamil-speaking residents in Boston area in Massachusetts very vocal about it, and they put the tremendous pressure on the US Congress to engage in Sri Lanka. Even at the last phase of the Sri Lankan war, many Tamil speaking people protested in the White House. So there is a political engagement is also there, but it is very limited in Sri Lankan diaspora compared to Canada, for example, where they have Indian origin member of the parliament, for example, and there is a huge presence in England. But in the US, there is still yet to come because they are very engaged in a very highly professional group of people from Sri Lanka. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mendes. Now, finally, Dr. Sally.
Thank you, Mr. Pillai. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, firstly, let me commend Rajesh, Hema, and their colleagues for putting together what was a very laborious piece of work, trying to assemble a cast of writers from across the world on the Sri Lankan diaspora, and then packaging the book in the way that Rajesh described. I think it's a nice combination of overall context, not too long, just about right, I think. Some interesting side angles on Sri Lankan culture generally, subsuming the diaspora influence on food, on religion, and other things. And then, of course, going into country and regional sections. In other words, it's packed full of interesting and sometimes colorful detail with lots of nuggets that you'll appreciate when you read it. So I most certainly would urge you to pick it up and leaf through it. Let me, in my remaining time, add a personal touch. I'm going to talk about my entry in the volume, and the title of it is Growing Up Half-Half in a Muslim Family. What I try and do in this short essay is give a sense of my changing views of Sri Lanka from the time of my childhood when I grew up there all the way to the present. And the lens I use is growing up in an extended Muslim family in Colombo, and with a little twist, because I grew up half-half. I'm half British and the other half is Sri Lankan, although the half of that is Sri Lankan may not be immediately apparent to you when you look at my face and hear how I speak. So there is that lens, and what I do is I try and set it against the backcloth of changes in society more broadly and in politics in particular. For the fortunes of my family and the vicissitudes of Sri Lankan politics have been very, very closely entwined. The essay starts off with a shipboard romance, and that's between my mother and my father. My father was in the Air Force. He did his training in the UK and then came back to Ceylon, as it then was. My mother was emigrating from Britain to Australia. They met on the ship, and over the next 3 years, obviously longer than the duration of the journey itself, there followed a courtship, engagement, and then my mother went to Ceylon to get married. And I came along in the mid-1960s, my 2 younger brothers thereafter. And what I remember from early childhood is an outwardly happy and prosperous extended family, very much against the backcloth of the waning years of Ceylon's post-independence golden age, as it were, a time of relative political stability and peace. This was during the UNP administration of Dudley Senanayake, who was the last gent of the old school to head a government in Ceylon or Sri Lanka. But then the family world crashed in the early 1970s. My father was arrested. My uncle couldn't come back to the country. There followed a court case. My father was in remand and then in jail for a little while. We were back and forth between Britain and Sri Lanka. So it was a turbulent time for the immediate family, but very much juxtaposed against a turbulent time for Sri Lanka generally, because that period saw a government with an increasingly dictatorial streak, which had a very heavy hand when it came to intervention in the economy. Indeed, the economy pretty much crashed during that time. And it was also a time of brewing ethnic tension. 1977, the government changed. My father was released from jail, and we left Sri Lanka. So that was the last year of my Sri Lankan childhood. And over the next almost 30 years, when I went back to Sri Lanka only very infrequently, my attitude to the country and to its people, and perhaps to the Muslim community in particular, became much more detached and distant, and to be frank, from a position of ignorance in those years, I viewed Sri Lanka as a rather narrow backwater, and there were other places that, as I say in the essay, occupied my reality and my imagination. Now that began to change about 6 or 7 years ago when I started going back to Sri Lanka more frequently. The first visit was, I think, in 2006, which was a few years after my father died. And I noticed quite early in that visit, which was a short one, that I was beginning to view Sri Lanka somewhat differently. So when I looked at people and places, flora, landscapes that I'd seen in my childhood, I realized that I was seeing them in a different way, with fresh eyes, as it were. And that led me to go back, and over the past few years, I've been going back frequently. I've done extended visits. I've traveled all over the island. I've hunted down interesting characters, not difficult in Sri Lanka because there is a character around every street corner, quite literally. And all of that has, in a sense, brought life full circle. So let me end by just asking a question to myself. What do I think of Sri Lanka today, and how is it different from the Sri Lanka I thought of as a child and thereafter? Well, that's too complicated a question to answer in the little time I have and in the context of this session. But suffice it to say that Sri Lanka is one of those countries that's shot through with incredible contradictions. So on the one hand, it's a land of aching beauty, and with incredibly attractive, alluring, beguiling people. But at the same time, it's a land, as a Colombo friend of mine puts it, that constantly misses buses, a land of unfulfilled promise. And it's also a land of cruelty and tragedy. How do I make sense of that? Well, as I said, I can't answer that question here. That's really a question for a book rather than a short essay. But I hope when I look at Sri Lanka and Sri Lankans today with a little bit more familiarity, as a half insider, half outsider, that it's with more tolerance, more empathy, more sympathy, certainly more curiosity than I had in my previous selves, at previous stages of my life. I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. Very interesting and colorful account. The history of Lanka encapsulated in a life. To do justice, you need, to your story, you need a Lankan Tolstoy. Well, that completes the contributions from the members of the panel. Now, can we have the lights up, please, so that I may see who's around? And I invite comments, questions from members of the audience. Thank you.
Oh, that's better. Yeah, this is better. Yeah.
Mr. Pillai?
I think that's one.
Good afternoon, Professor Tan and the rest of the
give the
panelists.
names
My name is Robin from the
They have to
Policy Maker.
identify themselves.
Yeah, I think they should.
Could you identify yourself, please, where
yes,
you're from and which,
Yes, I did.
you-
I'm Robin from the Policy Maker. I'm from the press. I have a question for Prof. Tan and the rest of the panelists, and that is, first of all, Prof. Tan, thank you for publishing this wonderful book. My question is, what's next for you? What's the next Diaspora project you have in mind after Sri Lanka? And second, for the rest of the panelists, what does Sri Lanka mean to you now after you have finished this project? Has that changed your perspective, the way you look at Sri Lanka?
I can give you a very, very short answer, and the simple thing is we don't know. This project has taken some time. As I said, thanks to the hard work of Hema and Rajesh and others. It took about 2 years for us to produce this volume, and and also thanks to the good work of EDM, they produced a beautiful volume. And we're very proud of it, and we will just now want to see how the readers respond to it. And after that, we'll take a look and see whether there is scope for yet another diaspora study of yet another part of the South Asian subcontinent. But at this point in time, we've not thought about it, so I give you the honest answer, I don't know.
Well, the first book took, I think, 4 years. On India.
Thereabouts, yeah.
So second one took 2 years.
2 years, it's getting
Third
shorter.
one year. So
1 year.
you're becoming more productive.
Now, the other thing about producing these volumes is that, they also resource intensive. So we need to raise money for it. And I think the first one also took some effort. So I think these are not easy sort of endeavors, both in terms of intellectual input and also support from various quarters.
Thank you. Yes, please, gentlemen.
My name is Sunil Govinagi. I live in Perth, but I was born in Sri Lanka when Dr. Vishnwadhan went to medical school. And first of all, I really want to acknowledge the work. I have yet to read the encyclopedia, and I really want to acknowledge Hema if she's here.
Yeah, she's behind there. Yeah, Hema is over there.
She has been really communicating me to get some input on my insignificant literary contribution from Australian perspective. I have kind of an observation and a question. An observation is I was impressed to listen to Dr. Patrick Mendes and his personal perspective on USA thing. I'm curious to find out whether there had been any chapters or things with regard to the general contribution of Sri Lankan in Australia. For example, I think it's very significant due to the fact that we all know about white Australian policy. I think we have some great global citizens, Australians, however we define them. For example, my mentor and friend, Dr. Laksiri Jayasuriya, he was the first experiment, according to the ambassador Australian ambassador Kim Beazley in Washington. He said at a book launch that, referring to Professor Jayasuriya, he's known as Lucky. Lucky was our first experiment of, hiring a non-white academic. And in fact, he was the first professor of social administration. So what I'm really trying to say is that there's a large, if you really focus on USA, if you talk about Australia is part of Asia, whether we like it or not, Australians like it or not, I think there should be focus on Australia. I don't know, I have yet to read the book. The second thing is about, and I think this is the ongoing thing, and because it's very difficult to define Sri Lankanness, whether you live in Australia or Singapore, or I think that's one of the very important, because we carry our perspective. When Michael Ondaatje look at, through his work, and his Ghost, for example, he brings his Canadian exotic burger Tamil sort of thing definition, which doesn't exist in my personal view, and so on and so on. And the second thing is, I think when we talk about diaspora, the role, which is partially alluding to Dr. Mendes, is about the role the Sri Lankan diasporic community plays in their own country, influencing the imagined homeland to which that, they only have annual trips or whatever it is. I mean, this was one issue that I have been talking with my last boss in Sri Lanka, Cyril Ponnamperumal. I used to be his media advisor. And I think these are some of the very important things. So congratulations, and I'm yet to read the book. I hope I'll get a copy. But I think perhaps you need to really immediately have a revision, because what's happening in homeland is horrible in my personal view. I can say that publicly. Particularly, I think Sri Lankan should come here, the big bosses over there, and learn how to create an identity which cut across all the ethnic groups, really. Though I carry the label Sinhalese Buddhist, it is a sad story happening in my mother country. So these are some of the issues I just want to share with the learned community. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think you had a question?
Then there's a question on the other side also. Then Elmo.
I'm Surya from our Institute of South Asian Studies. There has been a powerful impact made by the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora in terms of giving its version of the narrative about the problems in Sri Lanka in relation to the Sri Lankan Tamil minority. but one does not quite hear the same about any counter-narrative from the Sinhala diaspora. What is the level of polarization, if any, between the Sinhala diaspora and the Tamil diaspora in various countries across the world where the two happen to be present in sizable numbers? And why is it that the Sinhala diaspora seems to have not had an impact at all in terms of narrating its side of the story? I'm not trying to drive a wedge between the two communities, not at all, but I just would like to understand. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, anybody brave enough to tackle that question?
Well,
You're
I can start with taking some parts of this question.
Yeah.
The first thing to say is that, thank you, these are excellent questions. First thing to say is that the section on Australia is quite well covered. In fact, you mentioned Professor Laksari. He was included in the book, but as well right at the back, commending this book. So rest assured, Australia is well covered. I think it's a good time to talk a little bit about the limitations in terms of coverage, since you've raised the issue of Australia. One of the issues that we faced in this volume as we were doing it is really the development of scholarship on the Sri Lankan diaspora has not evolved as much as the Indian case. For the simple reason of numbers, because you have a diaspora that is effectively 1/10 the size of the Indian one. And so scholarship is limited. And in this sense, I think our coverage in terms of regions is weaker in Africa, where we really, I know of communities residing in South Africa, for example, but it was very difficult to get scholars to write about this. South America too. So in this sense, I think these are areas where we need to do further research, South America and Africa. And the third, I think, also to some extent in East Asia. I know, again, that there are bourgeoising, though still small, Sri Lankan communities that have now begun to establish themselves. But unfortunately, we have not yet got the scholarship to properly represent this. So let me take the easier part of this question and maybe some of the more difficult questions you would like to take.
Dr. Sully?
Well, I don't have a deep answer to Mr. Suryanarayan's question. I just have two quick observations, and this links back with the question that was asked by the journalist who was over on the other side. On my reading of the book, what new things did I learn? Two things in particular. The first is about the waves of the diaspora, which you talked about earlier. So, what were perhaps more common push or pull factors before 1983 among the various communities, mainly among middle-class professionals, then became very different push factors, particularly with this burgeoning Tamil diaspora after 1983. So unfortunately, in many countries around the world, we now see two diasporas living in separate worlds who give themselves different labels. And that's, of course, a reflection of what's happening back in the mother country, or countries, depending on which way one looks at it. That's just one quick observation. The other one is this. In a couple of the entries in the diaspora, there is mention of how well Sri Lankans do abroad, whether they be Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, or Christians. They're generally law-abiding. They don't cause problems where they go. They have a preference. They have a strong education ethos. And parents have a preference not for their children setting up startups and becoming multimillionaires in Silicon Valley, but to go into the professions and become doctors, lawyers, engineers, and accountants. Now, the striking thing about this is that this seems to be a common preference among Sinhalese, Tamils, and others. It's not a distinction between the two. And it's also striking in my mind because there is, of course, a common stereotype within Sri Lanka that it's the minorities who are productive with an education ethos and a work ethic, but that's not true historically and culturally with the majority community. Well, maybe not, but in the diaspora, that seems not to be the case. All the different ethnicities have that work ethic and education ethic, which reminds me of a question that was once posed by an opposition member of parliament in the Lok Sabha to Mrs. Gandhi when she was Prime Minister, and it was a rhetorical question. It was this: why is it, Prime Minister, that Indians do very well in every jurisdiction except yours?
This gentleman, I think, had a
Patrick wants to add something.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
There is a right side to the left side. Three observations, and I just wanted to reflect on these three gentlemen to ask, not in that order, by the way. The ethnic politics in America is a good thing because just like what happened in Northern Ireland, there are tremendous internal American ethnic politics in Irish American influence our policymakers to take a role in Ireland, a peacemaking process. I am hoping that in a very subtle way, it is now in action in the US and London and elsewhere in European capitals, what happened after the war. So that is, you will see in March, UN Human Rights Council taking this matter into the discussion. This is ethnic politics in action, you can see that. The other observation that the former colleague of late Dr. Ponnamperuma said, I'm a little bit disappointed with the way Sri Lanka is being governed right now. It was fascinating to observe, look back to 1960s when the former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, said, someday, he said in 1960s, someday I wanted to make Singapore like Sri Lanka. Now, almost 50 years later, we look to Singapore, this dynamic, several communities working together that bring that Singapore small city state surrounded by the so-called Muslim countries. Striving remarkably is a given example is still now we need to have Sri Lankan president should ask in the next 50 years we want to make Sri Lanka like Singapore. I think there are so much things to learn. And the last observation is, I would say, the reporter asked, journalist asked the question, what do I learn from this process? Working with my colleagues over here, even my good colleague Hema is a Sri Lankan connection, ancestry to there. And working with this remarkable group of people is what I is. I am a Hindu, I am a Catholic, I am a Buddhist, I am a Burgher, and I am a Sinhalese, I am a Tamil, I am a Hindu, and I am a Sri Lankan, even though I am living in America. But I don't have a Sri Lankan citizenship. But in order to go back home, I have to pay, I think, $40 US, and then get back before 30 days. But still, inside, I can have that Sri Lankan, the uniqueness of Sri Lanka, just like Singaporean are proud of being Singaporean. So to me, I am again the Buddhist, Catholic, Hindu, and Muslim. These are not my words, by the way. This is Mahatma Gandhi said that. Thank you.
I wanted to comment on my friend Laksari Jayawardena, who was in school with me, he would have had a lot to say about communities in Australia, I would have thought. He used to be known as Kappa in school, so I would have thought he would have commented on the problems, points that you made about the two communities. Did he not make any comments? Laksari?
Surya.
Dr. Surya raised. I think there is that, well, I have really lived half of my life in Australia, but I still, I have lived in Australia in Perth half of my life, or a little less. 25 years is a very long time for anybody in a natural history. But I still do, I speak Sinhala. I can be labeled as Sinhalese, but I'm Australian, carrying a passport if you challenge me. But the point is that I do write in Sinhala, so I observe, but I don't participate. I call it Sri Lankan mafia. It's a generic term that I have coined as a joke. But I think what is happening, this is a pure hypothesis, but I can really bring facts to support that later on if somebody challenges me. The issue is that we are mirroring what we have brought from home. For example, the classic case is that there is a Royal College dinner, Ananda College dinner, and a Sinhala Buddhist temple. So we are really mirroring. So my observation, hypothesis with regard to that is that Sri Lankan diaspora we are influential like Katha Lucky Jayasuriya, but we have not fully integrated into the community which we have domiciled. That's one observation. I think that's very important. And if we really go to a country, we should really get integrated, learn literature, culture, not only acquiring education and so on. So there is dialogue among Sri Lankan Sinhalese Buddhists, which is going in parallel, but there is no question about integration. There's a group called Spur based in Eastern Australia. They are very Sinhala chauvinists. I would say this very publicly. And I think the important thing is that if you have any Sri Lankan genes in your system, Dr. Mendy, I think what we need to really raise the question is, what is the post-Civil War identity that we should really embrace? Is it going to be dominant Sinhalese Buddhist? I think that's the biggest challenge Sri Lanka will really face. And that should be an issue that the diaspora community, that's a good project, Professor Young, and there would be a lot of money coming from America, if you ask me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have apparently 5 minutes more.
Elmo has been trying to ask some questions. Elmo.
Yeah, but the hall is not booked, this particular hall, for another session.
Yeah,
so we can continue, but there is a competing session on connectivity led by Professor Jayakumar. So those who want to connect, go there. Those who want to remain here and pursue this discussion, do you have any objection to that?
Tea break.
There's also a tea break, so it's a question of whether you want tea or you want...
No, there is a question, sir.
And I think my
has a question.
My friend, Mr. Srinivas, is voting with his feet.
There's not really a question. This is something I've been involved in. I cannot remember the names. But I think the first 5 people that formed the non-aligned group, one was Sri Lanka. I forget the name. At the same time with Jawaharlal Nehru,
Bandaranaike.
Nasser.
Bandaranaike.
The name is that. All right. The other name that I remember is Atalat Mudaliar. I don't know if somebody remember him. He used to teach law here.
Yes.
He was a minister in...
Of trade and development.
Yeah, when I took a delegation from Singapore to Ceylon, Sri Lanka, I've done twice, I'd met him. And he was very, very positive that the ports in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, would overtake Singapore in a few years. Unfortunately, he died, and the president, I think at that time was Prem Das.
No, J.R. Jayawardena.
He also
1977,
yes, he also
is
was
a
shot dead.
cabinet minister.
There's another very prominent Sri Lankan High Commissioner who was in Singapore. He's passed away. I think when Premadasa came here, he was still the High Commissioner. I think his daughter is a lawyer here. He was the man who really galvanized these Indian Ocean Economic Zone conferences.
Ambassador Surly Amarasinghe.
Yeah, that's right, yes. And the other great Sinhalese I remember is Atalat Mudalia, not Atalat Mudalia, the writer Tarzi Vitachi.
Yeah.
Brown Sahib? Yes.
He was later at the UNICEF in New York as a deputy executive director.
That's right, that's right. And, there was a protest against the jailing of Faiz Ahmad Faiz in Pakistan by the then dictator who was the president. And there was a worldwide complaint from writers from all over the world. We had at that time Han Suyin in Singapore who led that. And there's a whole range of renowned world people who signed this petition. I remember that also. So even with all that, I wish it's still a very beautiful country. We visit it sometimes. Incidentally, on the stock exchange in the commodities exchange in Colombo, the stock price for copra is named after a name called Heptullah Boy, is a Bora name from India. But that's the gauge. If you want to know the price of copra, in those days when I was a young man, I was dealing in that from Singapore. You read these, about that. And the first exporter of rubber to communist China was from Sri Lanka too. I forget the name of the person, it was a Khoja gentleman. Thank you. I just had some recap.
I think this gentleman here do you still want to ask a question or?
Yeah, Elmo.
A short comment, yeah?
Yeah, Elmo.
Thank you. My name is Elmo. I am from Sri Lanka. I would like to ask a question from the learned panel there. Because you are all belonging to...
Closer, louder please.
Louder?
Closer,
right,
closer.
Right. What I'd like to ask you is, from the Sri Lankan diaspora, what do you feel about Sri Lanka today? You write a book, you do research, you do all kinds of things, wonderful. We can all read it when we get the chance, but Sri Lanka today is divided by one line. On one side is the political culture. It doesn't matter what party is in power, there is a culture. On the other side is the mountains, the rivers, the people, the ordinary people who are wonderful people. And there is a great need for those ordinary people to rise from the ashes of the war, to have peace, right? I find, very sad to say, a lot of the diaspora that they love their country. They want to go back on holidays, and they want to do so many things. But my question is there a bigger role they can play, not with the government, not with the politics of the country, but with the ordinary who are in dire need of some assistance from their own countrymen who is gone off and who's done very well, as Dr. Razin very clearly explained? Is there something that the Sri Lankan diaspora can do for their roots? Thank you.
Okay, good. Now I know a gentleman here, who's sitting down in a corner there. We just written a member of the Diaspora who's just written a book which was published 3 weeks ago. Huh? Stand up and be identified, Dr. Puvan. Because the gentleman's question, I think, was meant for you.
Mike.
Puvan, not too long, please.
Pillai.
This guy, I think he was even more productive than ISIS. He wrote his book in 6 months.
That's very good.
Sorry, you can hear me?
He's
I was
threatening a
very
second
clear about
volume.
what you were asking.
Yeah.
I suppose you were asking me, for example, what I can do for my country, for my route. I do a lot for my route. I don't send money to everybody in Sri Lanka. People, when they collect money, I don't give a cent. But I identify first from my own family, my cousins, second cousins, so on. I would say I've helped up at least 15 to 20 young boys. I've brought them up to, sent them to Australia, all over, helped them with money, put them on their feet. And the last boy who wrote to me, I was really touched. He went to Sydney and he said, Uncle, with your help, I bought 7 houses in Sydney. That gives me the ultimate happiness. I've done something very concrete. That's all I do. And I wrote a book which reflects from my heart what I am. I don't consider myself a foreigner here. I'm a Singaporean, but yet my heart is divided. It has got larger. So I'm able to accommodate Singapore as my country, and Sri Lanka, I am not lost any love for it. I don't think I answered you in full.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Patrick wants to say something.
He just said, oh, sorry, yeah, please. Come.
Yes.
Prof?
To Elmo Jordan, just to respond to your question, I think you addressed to the panel, am I right? Okay, thank you. You asked 2-point questions. One is, what does the diaspora do to help their motherland because they are very successful in their home, their adopted countries? And 2 ways to respond to you. One is I actually did write about the Sri Lankan issue in a larger framework of US-China relation because of that, just like Myanmar became pro-Chinese to pro-American, and now pro-American government turned into a pro-Chinese in the in Sri Lanka, and that $6 billion investment going into Sri Lanka, they are more affiliation with Beijing than Washington. So I wrote about in this book is what they call the peaceful war, Chinese dream and American destiny, but largely concentrated on Sri Lanka's, that what they are building is that Lotus Tower in the middle of Colombo, which reflect the Buddhist uprising. And somebody earlier talked about Buddhist nationalism, which is also reflect the Sri Lanka's that Buddhist nationalism in the Lotus Sutra, and also it goes nicely with the Chinese idea of the peaceful rise, which I explain in this one by looking at the Fahian, the Buddhist monk who came 412 AD to Sri Lanka, and Marco Polo to onward and so forth. So that's that part of it. And I should congratulate people like you who do extraordinary work and helping the poor people. I told you earlier, I wish I knew you when I was riding water buffaloes in Polonnaruwa, and I never dreamed about going to America because I didn't speak the language. I was the only experiment. Out of 120,000 people applied, only 9 went to America. And out of that 9, I was only the outside Colombo and Kandy and Jaffna. So you can see now what I do is I have my own scholarships. My previous 7 books, all the money went to Sri Lanka. 2 scholarships at Sri Jayewardenepura University, others 15 in a Buddhist temple and a Catholic church, because my mother was a Buddhist. father was a Catholic. I am a Buddhist Catholic myself. So that is the way I say thank you to my country. But the 8th book, this one, all the proceed goes to the University of Minnesota because I thought 7 book is good enough for Sri Lanka, then this one for 2 Americans, to say thank you to America who adopted me as an American.
Thank you, Professor. Well, I'm told, sorry, Dr. Puban, I'm told I have to draw this session to a close now because there is the other session, and some of you may want to go there, and if you are so attracted to this session, you may not do justice to that session. So, Prof. Tan, I don't know whether you want to sum up, because
he's very absent-minded.
I find it quite tricky, but you're a
Okay.
pro in this game.
No, I think a few takeaways. Number one, I think the suggestions, the reflections, the kinds of stories that you've suggested, if you look at the volume, you will find that most, if not all, are already contained in the volume. I think the unfortunate thing is that the volume was only launched last night, so most of you will not have seen it, but if you look at it, you'll find that many of the things that you've raised have already been covered in that volume. That's number one. Number two, of course, we don't pretend that this is the last word on the Sri Lankan diaspora. It is a start. We are making a start, and we hope that the ideas contained in this book, the stories, will trigger more stories. And we hope to see maybe a volume 2 or volume 3, maybe not done by ISAS, but by anybody who wants to take up the study further. And we hope that this will spark further studies. And of course, we hope that this book will also reach as wide an audience as possible, so that when the diaspora reads it, there could be some reconnection with the motherland, so to speak. And we hope that if we are able to achieve that with this volume, I think this encyclopedia would have achieved its purposes. So maybe I'll end on those notes.
Thank you very much, Professor Tan. And I would say, not only the connection with diaspora and the motherland, but greater integration within the diaspora itself. Of course, they also have to integrate with their host countries, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But there's also a distinctive element in the Lankan diaspora, and they should. The fervent hope is that they'll be able to overcome the many differences that have surfaced in the homeland. Those differences do not have to be exported. So thank you all very much. I'm sorry I have to bring the guillotine down now, but
MC will take over.
Thank you very much. So how many of you noticed Professor Tan's reaction when he was asked, what's the next topic of research? What's the next topic of the book? How many of you noticed it? His instant reaction was, so this is the reason why he responded that way, and let's find out if that response was candid enough and honest enough by actually going and purchasing this. You can either remove your smart devices out right now and go on Amazon and buy it online. Alternatively, do it the old school style, go to a bookstore on 26th November. That's when it'll be available in the bookstores. Thank you very much. I'm really sorry. I know everybody still wants to continue having this discussion, but I'm sure you'll also want to have a bit of tea or coffee before we start the next session. So, tokens of appreciation for all our guests here. Yeah, Mr. Pillay, if you could please present the tokens. I can assure you the contents will be the same, the ribbon may be missing, but that's fine. Thank you once again. And a really quick cup of tea or coffee. We've got only 5 minutes till the next session.